Aloha, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Our Undoing Radio. We are continuing our season-long discussion on the meaning of the word sacred, or the various meanings of the word sacred. And today's guest is my good friend, Tyler Kokjohn, who is a doctor, a microbiologist, and a professor, and he's retiring soon. So hopefully, Tyler, with any bit of luck, welcome to the show, and we can bag on your colleagues by name. Is that how it works when you retire?
Yeah, I guess. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, I'm kidding, of course. So when we talk about the sacred, and we say often, of course, life is sacred. But then I know that you are up in arms about a lot of the genetic testings going on. So it seems as though on the molecular and, I don't know, atomic level, genetic level, something level, maybe life isn't sacred. The building blocks of life, not as sacred as life itself. I don't know. So I kind of want to get into that with you, but I would love to know what your background is with this word sacred, if it holds any meaning for you.
It does. I was raised Catholic, so I spent years in catechism. And they get you young, and so a lot of this stuff becomes very core to you. And I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but things that you were taught when you were 5 and 6 years old come right back. And they're stuff that terrifies me. I think I told you once, very afraid of nuns. And with good reason. They could hit any human being faster with an 18-inch ruler than is actually humanly possible. But they were into discipline, and as a little kid, and even as an adult, me not so much. So sometimes that didn't work very well. Plus, I had this big sister, okay, who was an angel. And so she paved the way for me, because of course all the nuns remembered her, and they thought, oh yeah, he's horrible. What happened? So anyway,
well, what would you say sacred meant to the nuns? I mean, was this just sort of a word that they threw around, or do you think they really had a belief that had a feeling involved? In other words, was it all just a thought construct, or do you think they felt anything about the word and about, being nuns, being Jesus's wives?
I think they did, and the reason I say that is because they really walked, the talk. They were there for real. They were dealing with bratty little kids. One of my teachers, I also went to a college that was run by the Sisters of St. Francis, which turned out to be really good because they were also into rigor and discipline, which was something I didn't really internally have at that time and needed. It was either that or the Marine Corps. Okay, so my dad thought, well, let's let him try college before we ship him off. And that worked out okay. But one of my instructors began as a nurse, and she was telling me some of the things that she had to do as part of her professional practice. And these are dedicated people. I mean, it's seriously dedicated. And looking back, I think as a kid, of course, I didn't understand that. But even as a young adult, it took me a long time to realize that, yeah, they had consigned their lives basically to what they considered to be the sacred truth and its execution on earth, and trying to make this a better place and helping people, and they did it. So all credit to them as far as I'm concerned. And that's not to say that bad things weren't done in the name of religion. They were certainly trying to make amends for it in their little part of the world.
Right. Well, so then you grow up and you leave Catholicism far, far behind and become an arrogant atheist scientist. Is that how that works?
Fairly close. I would not describe myself as an atheist. And some of my colleagues certainly are, and maybe are even offended at the idea of higher beings or whatever, or greater experience, however you want to put it. I think maybe the closest for me formal description would be deist. And so I think one time I think you and Jeff and I talked about this, but
no one here knows who Jeff is. Whenever I'm doing radio.
Oh, okay, Jeff Ritzman, and so a former co-host on a show known as Paratopia back in an earlier life.
Right.
And one of the things that I've always kind of felt is somehow, at least in my life, I've encountered these really remarkable teachers at just the right moment, and maybe that's because I was ready to learn, or everything just kind of clicked or whatnot. But those people pushed me forward and helped me so much and changed who I was. And that happened at Briar Cliff College with Sister Regina Collins and Sister Mary Claire O'Toole. That they were biology and chemistry, and then another biology teacher in Baldwin. They were all right there, and they kind of set me off on this ecology bent. It's something that I was interested in, but I didn't understand even that I was. And they started to show me stuff, and I'm going, this is cool. That's how it fits together. So it's one of those things that a series of decisions put me in this place. I don't know how that happened. I don't believe that I'm predestined for anything or was predestined for anything, but yet it happened, and it made a big difference in my life. So I've always kind of felt like things do happen, and you meet people and encounter people. And it's up to you to figure out, like, I should take advantage of this. I should exploit this.
I think that's excellent language here for our.
But I'm not. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that. But anyway, I'm not a rip-roaring atheist.
Okay. Let me ask you this: something that we talked about privately, and I think we can talk about publicly, is when you. I think, did you say you were a grad student when you were? Sort of what you were forced to do your work in a place that had irradiated bones on one side of you and radiation on another side. Can you tell people what that was?
Heck no. That was when I was actually an assistant scientist at Argonne National Laboratory. And yes, on the one side of me was the Atlas Heavy Ion Accelerator. I was in the Environmental Research Division. And on the other side was a morgue. And what they were doing, the Department of Energy has always been interested in radiation biology. And it had major, multiple million, probably billion-dollar initiatives to study the impacts of radiation on humans and other organisms. And part of that is because of its military implications. I think we have to be very clear. But in the morgue, they had exhumed the bodies, mostly young women, who had painted watch dials with radium. There's a book out called, I think the title is The Radium Girls. Very interesting about how these things unfolded. But these young ladies would dip brushes in radium salts and then paint the numbers so that they would glow in the dark. Well, eventually they would have to point the tips, and so they would just put them in their mouth and purse their lips and get a solid or a sharp point. Well, they got big doses of radium, and it was horrific, absolutely horrific, because radium is the type of radionuclide that will, or isotope that will not isotope, nuclide I think is a. See, I took all those courses at Department of Energy, and now I can't remember a damn thing. Anyway, the radioactive element radium releases alpha particles, and once they get in your body, they don't get out. So every bit of radioactivity interacts with your tissue. Now, mostly radium goes into the bone, and so it's relatively safe there, but still they would get osteosarcomas and other things with chronic exposure. The book describes what happened with people that got big acute doses and how horrible that was. But anyway, they had, the Department of Energy had a long-standing interest, and they had secured permission from the relatives to exhume these bodies. And I think that what they did is take the femur and look at that basically to see if there was evidence of the bones, see if there was any evidence of osteosarcoma or other cancers, get the medical records where they could, and then they would take samples and count how much radioactivity was still there. It's fairly simple to do working backwards to the time of employment and figuring out what dose that person has and had gotten. And my coworker, his name was Robert Thomas, everybody knew him as Thomas, kind of told me that what they were doing at that point was it was pretty much over because the doses were so low that they weren't getting anything on like a dose response curve. Like if you had this many millisieverts of radiation that you would have X number of cancers, that they were just down kind of bouncing around the spontaneous rate. So he was actually tasked with closing out that project. But that's what I had on the one side, the bones, on the other side, the Atlas accelerator. That's where I lived during my career at Argonne National Laboratory.
So, outside of that being probably kind of like funny, spooky, did you have a real feeling about that? What was your feeling about being sandwiched between those two things?
Yeah, it was scary. And the reason is because you hope that everybody conducts themselves with the nuclides very, very carefully, but spills can happen. Stuff can end up, the dust from carving up the bones, all that stuff can get everywhere, and then you can be part of that project too if you're not careful. So there's always that kind of like, watch what you're doing. And I'm not going to kid you, Jeremy. I once thought that I had been killed while I was working there. Because every 6 months, since we're in these special radiation environments, we had to have a physical and a complete physical with blood draw, and then they would do an overnight urine collection. You would just get a number, you would go get, it looked like a lunch pail and had a big thermos bottle, and then you would fill that during the night, bring it back in, and then they would do the analysis. But the rules were that you had to be informed what your results were. And so I reported to the doctor's office, and first thing in the morning, I came in, I signed in, and one of the assistants came out, and she looked at my name, went right over to the office door, and she said, "He's here." And another one of the assistants came out, and they're both looking at me. And I thought, oh my God, I'm white hot with radioactivity. And they don't know whether to run, call the fire department or whatever. Somehow I'd been contaminated. My big worry was plutonium. I was always afraid of plutonium. I don't think anybody was working with it there, but the real interest of DOE was in radium was plutonium because they kind of worked the same way. And so anyway, they go back and get the doctor, and he comes right out and he says, "Oh, we've been waiting for you." And I'm telling you, I walked 10 paces, and it was like going to the gallows. I thought, okay, all right, I'm not going to, how much time do I have? All those things that go through your mind. And he sits me down and he said, "What kind of diet do you have?" And I looked at him and said, "Well, nothing special." He says, No, are you a vegan? Are you a strict vegetarian? Do you avoid certain? I said, "You don't understand. I'm ding dongs, ho-hos, and Twinkies. I cheated the morning of the test. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had a donut." And so before the blood draw, and he was so deflated. My cholesterol levels and total fat levels were extremely low. And so they thought, oh, this guy has solved the secret to diet and longevity and everything. And so they wanted to know what my regimen was. And I had to tell him like 3 times, no, seriously, I'm going to go out to Hardee's at lunch and just pound down a bunch of fries and a burger. And but that's
so
why
you didn't die then, but you have told us what you will die of later. So that's nice.
Very, very likely. Yeah.
Well, all right. Let's get into it then. So, what is? And for you personally, then having gone through this, what about life, or is life sacred? And if so, what about it is sacred? What is it that you stayed in science. I'm assuming that this type of situation, which I've heard similar things before, is fairly common in science where, you're just working around stuff that could kill you. Sign this waiver. But you stuck with it, and yet you still rail against, if you saw an article about a scientist who was stuck between irradiated bones and a reactor or whatever, you would probably tweet about it harshly, right?
Good question.
Explain yourself to me.
In 2 minutes. Yeah, I did stick with science, and what I was doing in the it's called ER division, Environmental Research Division of Argonne, is working with a crew that was trying to develop means to bioremediate pollution. And one of the reasons I stuck in microbiology was that it didn't have to kill a whole lot of animals, and that was something I just never really had much talent for. But the idea was that you can do good, and so working with viruses, for example, bacterial viruses, the overarching goal of that was developing treatments that would help people fight off antibiotic-resistant strains of Staph aureus, for example. So there's plenty of good to be done. Where I get very exercised is actually I've been writing about it. Is stuff about the instrumentality stuff, where we get so excited about the science. Remember from Jurassic Park, that line of you guys were so excited basically about what you were doing, you didn't think about whether we should do it. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. And so what I see is, particularly recently with DARPA, projects that are just kind of off the wall, and it's like, you guys and ladies, think.
What is DARPA for people?
Defense Advanced Research Agency Program, or Program Agency, I think it is DARPA. Okay. And so they're the guys who are the cutting edge of stuff like, hey, we'll make you super resistant to radiation, and then you can be an astronaut. And there's a lot of, this is the interesting thing, is much of what is done in science is called dual use, that you can apply it to civilian life. For example, the radiation resistance, that might really help patients who are undergoing cancer chemotherapy and radiation, for example, in particular. It could be a very important therapeutic adjunct to help people. But, you could also make soldiers, sailors, Marines super resistant to radiation, and then you don't have to have any shielding, or they can go out on the battlefield or whatnot. And maybe that's a contribution. But I certainly hope, and where I get most exercise about the instrumentality is with the radiation resistance. DARPA came up with a great plan. We won't change your genomic sequence, because I think they got holy hell for proposing to change people's genomes to do this. And so they said, we'll just change the gene expression. We'll just jigger it the way we want, and then everything will be fine. Well, sure, if it works. But if you go back to the radium dial painters, it can take a long time for the full manifestations of radiation exposure to occur. There's acute exposure for sure, but there's other people who were exposed chronically and carried the radium in them for a long time. And the cancers, well, it was a different profile than they expected, and it was harder to account for this stuff. So my point would be like, yeah, you get to step one, you've tested it for a whole year, but that young recruit has 50, 60, 70 years of life ahead of them. Are you really going to be able to make sure that there aren't any secondary or consequential changes that come down and kill them later? And my feeling is that's going to be a hard one to prove. So I hope they have really good informed consent. Anyway, but this is what gets me really exercised is you think, what are you really proposing here? And how is it really a great benefit? Well, with the cancer therapy, you could say, yeah, that's pretty clear, and they're in desperate straits. With the military, we do order people to their deaths. I wish that we didn't. But astronauts exploring space, I don't know, maybe we're not cut out for that. And so that sort of like my philosophy is, we're going to have a hell of a time improving on nature. We haven't had much success with that before, so we'll have to think very carefully. And so I get upset when I see colleagues that I feel like are not maybe thinking carefully.
Well, explain this to me, because I'm sure you hang out with more of them than I do. Atheists, humanists, who say that they're working, it's sort of the Old Testament, right? Like, what's important is man, and everything else is in service to man. And yet the service that they're doing is to poison ourselves, to poison all of us, it seems. like with each improvement, of course, comes something awful. You know? So you've got GMOs, you've got built-in poisons to crops, you've got every sort of drug that they push at you, pharmaceutical, has a side effect of like making you suicidal or giving you a disease. You look at these things, or like I've been going off on social media about the Impossible Burger at Burger King, Of course, now this is a plant-based burger. Hooray! But of course, it's the worst plant-based burger. So we're going to poison ourselves that way and trick ourselves into believing we're getting healthier. And if this is brought to us primarily by people who say that they are in this to advance and evolve humankind, what do you think the disconnect is where we're actually poisoning ourselves?
Well, I think part of it, Jeremy, is that we're not so good at figuring out consequential damages. And so we have cascades of problems and fixes and fixes to the fixes that we
But we know that the cascading damages are going to happen. See, this is my point. It's like we're not naive to this now. We may not know what they are, but we know they're coming and we don't care. We just keep doing them anyway. We keep selling ourselves on the new and improved that is actually more poison. So, what do you think that they ever think about it in that way or not? I mean, I would think that like one of the benefits of a religion or a spiritual outlook, although I don't promote any of those, but if I can say like a benefit of it would be that you care about life. And so you might not do these things that you say are advancing humanity, although probably I'm wrong. But I would like to think that you wouldn't as much do these things that are actually poisoning us.
I hope that you're right. I can tell you that one of the things that's happened, now this is just the opinion of one person, but with the genetically modified foods, for example, that the debate has been able to focus on the relative safety to humans. And so we have a kind of a standard of generally regarded as safe, but for these new modified foods, we test them to some extent. But if you think about what we're going through now with glyphosate, and so the genetically modified soybeans that we feed to the cows to make the miracle burgers or whatnot, one of the things that people are not so good at is figuring out cascades of events in the environment. And glyphosate has had some environmental costs, and it's turned out maybe some legacies that we didn't reckon on. And part of that is that our testing times are relatively short, and residence in the environment and impacts in the environment relatively long and subtle. And you always hear that complaint that, well, if you follow the precautionary principle, you guys won't let anything get done. And that's also a little bit true as well.
Well, do you think that if one of the tenets of science was that life is sacred, like if people really believed that, then they couldn't do the kind of science that they do because they would have to acknowledge the chain of events. They would have to look for it ahead of time. They would have to understand the interconnecting nature of nature, which, people give lip service to, but they don't actually seem to incorporate that into their actions. Do you think that they could not do science if they thought life was sacred?
That's a good one. I would come forward and say there's no doctrine about life being sacred in science. And maybe some people will object to that, but it actually, if you think about it, we sacrifice a lot of animals in the course of research, for example, and so the way that we look at it is kind of like, well, if there is a sacredness to life, that extends only to human life. But if you go back and you start to look at statements that some very high level scientists have made about engineering and changing genomes and kind of messing with stuff, human life isn't particularly sacred to them either. And so I wouldn't say that's necessarily a shortcoming. I'd say that's just kind of how it is. that they're technically focused, but not necessarily, back to Jurassic Park again, not necessarily big picture focused.
Well, I guess then the question for them would be, and maybe you know the answer to this, what would be the benefit of creating Frankenstein people? Like, why is this considered evolution or forward thinking, or it's inevitable anyway, so we might as well do it? Like, all of these sort of, genetic manipulations and cyborg tech that we want to do to ourselves. Why is that an inevitability for the good of humanity?
Oh, that's a good one. Actually, I recall that we talked about one of these things before. Maybe it was with resurrecting the woolly mammoth or whatnot. But it's very interesting you picked Frankenstein, because now, just over 200 years after Mary Shelley wrote it, it's more relevant than ever. And people keep running up against the same kind of failures to comprehend that, you got to think about, what are you going to do if you have one resurrected Neanderthal? What kind of life do they have? How about a woolly mammoth? Can we really do some of these things? And what does it mean after that? We're just not thinking about these things very well at all. And so in essence, with some of the transhumanism, some of it, not necessarily all of it, we're doing our own 21st century redux of the Frankenstein story and not even understanding that that's what we're doing. So I find myself sometimes kind of amazed, sometimes appalled, but we're seeing this without, a thoughtless kind of reenactment of Frankenstein. It's the kind of story that a lot of kids would know instantly. And a lot of the high-powered scientists start talking about, well, yeah, we could do this, this, and this. We could have artificial wombs, and we don't even need them. And I tell you, it's kind of amazing to watch the big brains sort of trip over themselves when it comes to thinking out loud about the future.
When I was a wee young lad, I learned about science that, you form a hypothesis, and then you test it, and then it becomes a theory if it works, and then you test it. And it's all of this trial by error sort of thing. Is it still that way? Because it sounds like it's still that way, which means that, in other words, it's not inclusive of thinking out consequences, like possible consequences that might be reasons to not do the experiment in the first place. Do people think in those terms, or do they just go, well, we'll do it and see what happens?
They do both. There have been, you've heard of CRISPR? The clustered, so that's an engineering technique that we have now. That wasn't found by a hypothesis. That was found by accident. CRISPR refers to the observation, these clustered, regularly interspaced repeats in bacterial genomes. And when they saw them, nobody knew what they were. And then finally they figured out, like, oh my God, it's a viral defense system. And then later they figured out, like, we could use this. Then the question becomes, okay, let's do that. And so we demonstrate its feasibility, but we don't know how well it works. We don't necessarily know how controllable it is, but we've got the tools. Some of the leading scientists, to their credit, have said, whoa, hold it, stop. We can use it in certain cases, but not others. We have to be really, really careful here. We don't know what's going on. With gene drives, the people that basically came up with the concept also said, oh, yeah, but we have to be careful. It's a little bit cat out of the bag kind of situation, though. They've already built the damn thing. And now we want to be careful with it. And moreover, they've disseminated the information. So hopefully this will work out better. But to get to your basic idea is, they do. Some of the people have seen the problems and have moved to try to manage them, to mitigate them. That does happen. But I think you're absolutely right, Jeremy, that we break it down piecemeal in a way that we think like, I need to find out if I can cut this piece of DNA. And then I need to find out if I can put this thing extra in the little construct that does that. And then I need to find out how I get it into cells. So one little step at a time, then suddenly there you are with a tool, and now how are we going to use it? So it's quite conducive to breaking it down in such a way that we don't see the big picture. But nonetheless, some of the scientists have become aware and alarmed, and have worked really hard to educate their compatriots. And there's a difference of opinion. And so, but we have the CRISPR babies. Somebody said, "Oh, I can take this and do that," and they did it. And that maybe won't work out so well for those babies. We hope for the best, but this is where we are. The tools are out there. The knowledge is out there. People are going to use it.
I know you're a world traveler, and you've been to various sites that some people would consider to be sacred sites around the world. Did you ever get a feeling from any of them that you would describe as sacred?
Oh, they're fascinating, and it's to me what I really kind of enjoy is, and ever since I was a kid, I grew up in Western Iowa, and I liked walking around and realizing, I'm where they walked, kind of thing, and trying to figure out like how these people had the insights to put Machu Picchu together, and how they managed it is just absolutely stunning. And,
would you describe it as sacred? Would you describe how you felt as sacred?
Not to me. I would say it's a place that I recognize as being extraordinarily valuable and something that we have to preserve and recognize. But I wouldn't say that I had a feeling of oneness with the universe or anything such as that, if that's what you mean by
I don't know what I mean. I'm asking you. So oneness with the universe, would that be a sacred thing? Is that, I mean, how do you, is there room in your vocabulary for the word sacred? Let me ask it that way.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so give me an example of something that you find to be sacred, and what you feel or think about that.
No, that's a toughie. For me, it's the functioning environment, and knowing that we're not messing it up, that it can exist and will be there for our grandchildren and their grandchildren. That we've been bequeathed this incredible living world. We know now that there's all kinds of planets, but not very many like Earth at all. And where before it was kind of hypothetical, now it's sure that most solar systems don't look like ours, and very few planets look like Earth. We have a big responsibility to keep it going. So that's something where I kind of feel the sacred. Well, like this morning, I went out. I always go out in the morning to look at the stars because I get up real early. And the owls, we have great big horned owls around here. They're constantly making noise at me. They're making noise. They sing duets, believe it or not, and they're mated pairs. And I love that. That kind of gets me. So I would consider protecting that and ensuring that those things survive into the future. That's a sacred trust.
So
is that close enough?
Yeah. So I guess you could say then for you, at least two examples of sacred would be quiet moments where you're sort of spying upon the machinations of these birds, of nature, where you just find yourself in it. And wow, that's amazing. And continuity. I mean, the continuation of life itself is sacred.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if somebody who doesn't believe in the word sacred or doesn't have a place for it in any way that has a feeling attached to it would agree or not. But I would think that everyone wants to continue life. And so I guess I'm just backtrapped at, we know why dumb people don't do it. Right? But what about the really smart people? What about the people who claim to be promoting evolution as they see it? Why are we okay with poisoning ourselves when we ultimately say that we are trying to continue ourselves? I'm trying to get at this discrepancy here, and I can't quite do it.
No, I don't think you can. And I think, honestly, you've exposed kind of something that, honestly, folks maybe don't think about enough. And one of those things that, just go back to gene drives, which is something that's got me very upset. That's that's the idea of CRISPR being automated in such a way that it can be let out in the environment, and it just does what it does, and nobody can stop it. So we could change the genome basically of every wild species in our ecosystems at will to do what we think is best. So I'll just remind you that our management of the world has led to disasters in the Gulf of Mexico, the Dust Bowl in the 30s in the United States. Basically, the so-called, development of our resources has often led to their destruction. Our ability to formulate what is really a good goal is so inferior that I think we need to be really careful here. But I feel like there are a lot of people that look at gene drives and they say, we could use this to wipe out malaria, and that would be a good thing. The problem is they're ahead of themselves. They're so enthused about the technology, they're way ahead of themselves. Gene drives are a hypothetical. We don't know if they'll work, how well they'll work, and what sort of side effects they might have in the environment. And a lot of people are acting like they're proven, that all you got to do, Tyler, is tell us, okay, we go and release them and malaria will be cured. And it's never going to be that simple. I'm almost positive of that. But they're also sometimes not telling you the whole story. And one of the things that I think has come to the fore is, you know what Lyme disease is? Remember,
yes.
From living back east.
Mm-hmm.
So there are ticks that carry this disease to humans, and they live in the environment. Well, places like Nantucket Island are really heavily impacted by Lyme disease. It's a scourge. I'm not going to kid you. And there's a move afoot to genetically modify mice as sort of like a stalking horse for the use ultimately of gene drives to control Lyme disease in rodent populations. Jeremy, there's a vaccine that's ready that you could actually use against Lyme disease rodents, carrying rodents. It's at this testing stage already. You wouldn't have to modify the genetics of the populations. You wouldn't have to use this technology. And lo and behold, I don't recall ever seeing the proposals to do what are pretty fantastical science projects talking about, oh yeah, there's an alternative. Now, one of the things that these guys have run up against, I think, is when you're proposing to do environmental releases and whatnot, there are basically kind of the EPA and whomever is in charge has some rules, and one of the things that you have to do is talk about alternatives. Okay, here's our preferred solution, but here's an alternative solution. You also have to let the public weigh in. But I was kind of disappointed to see that some things were omitted, and I question that. And I know that their overall objectives are good. I seriously believe that. But I question the thing of half a story or not the full story and letting people decide. Our basic problem with Lyme disease, or one of the aspects, is that we've screwed up the environment. Okay, and this is the legacy. That we've changed things and we've changed how ecosystems function. And Lyme disease has prospered because of that, and we suffer. And our animals suffer. Dogs get Lyme disease as well.
So we don't actually want to look at the root causes oftentimes. We just
want
to deal with the flare.
We want we want the pill. We want the vaccine. We want this. And to a degree, I understand that. To a first approximation, those are important. But the underlying real problem of changing the ecology is that it ain't going away. And so this is always going to be there. And that's...
So we're lying to ourselves. I mean... Really, here I am right back. I mean, this is perfect for our Undoing Radio because it is my experience that this mind that we, the westernized mind that we say is, just human nature, to be wrong, to do wrong things, and to idealize not doing that as something that's impossible, isn't true. It's how we're living. It certainly is what we're doing. but it doesn't have to be this way. And I don't think that there's any way with this mind to get to the other side of that. I think it has to be abandoned altogether.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you escape yourself? And I don't know that I could. You have certain training.
Well, not can you escape yourself, but can you understand yourself so thoroughly that this self completely dissolves, and then the partial dissolves and a wholeness takes fruit? Is that possible?
I think it is, provided we allow enough people to express their opinions and respect their opinions. So one of the ways that that's happened out here in Arizona is through land use planning. And there's a lot of very intelligent, sincere people who, for example, when presented with certain plans to manipulate the environment, would probably be able to see through or understand or know and say, yeah, but you didn't think about this. So I don't know if you want to call it the hive mind, but the more eyeballs and diversity you have on it in that way, I think that makes us a little bit stronger. Now I can tell you also that there's no panacea, because I've seen the land use process just come off the rails, where plans were made and formulated and they didn't work, and unfortunately there was no going back. Okay, so that was the first time I'd ever thought something I'd never seen. Now I've seen so many things I can't believe. But have you heard of 9 Mile Canyon in Utah?
I don't think so.
It's sometimes called the world's longest rock art gallery, and unfortunately, it was also in a place that was economically valuable for natural gas, and so the companies naturally wanted to exploit that, and a lot of people got together to try to protect the resources. And ultimately, the resources were in fact exploited. But there were plans put in place to protect some of the rock art that were next to the road. There's only really one road through the canyon, major road. And they rerouted one road to avoid a really well-known panel called the Hunt in Cottonwood Canyon. Anyway, they did certain things, but the dust control measures didn't work. And it's like, well, hey, people, you got to improve this. These things are just covered with dust. What you're spraying down with water or the chemicals that you're using, they're not working. But what they needed was a plan. Apparently, it didn't have to work. They got the plan, and then they could just Katie bar the door, go ahead. So that was very disappointing to see the actual execution of the plan. But through the efforts of people and the cooperation, I'm not saying that the people who were mining the gas, producing the gas, were completely irresponsible. Some of it was saved, but it's not the same. This is the price of I guess progress.
Right.
Natural gas production has saved us, politically. It's important. I feel like we could do it in a way that we don't have to trash the world to get it. But
you're wrong. But anyway, thank you, Tyler, for thank you for doing this. I know it's probably not exactly in your wheelhouse talking about the sacred, but I appreciate you coming on and doing this anyway.
Yeah. Honestly, I think if you talk to a lot of people, professors, and except for the theologists, the sacred immediately, if it comes up as a topic, will cause them to kind of clam up. Because back in the day, hundreds of years ago, religion was the authority, and there was this extreme battle between the two. Now those days are over. The Vatican has its own observatory in Arizona. I don't know if you were aware of that.
No.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. And, there's that kind of antithesis to one's existence situation. That's over now. And there are some scientists who are openly religious in many ways. There's many of them. talking about the sacred, dealing with the sacred, or whatever, I think is probably going to cut through their comfort zone pretty quickly.